So the message today is about imminence, and if you saw that message that I posted about a week and a half ago on our Skype site, you'll have an idea of what this is talking about. And I was just going to leave it at that message, but Pastor Joe encouraged me to dig deeper into it and to put a sermon out of it. And that's what this is. And at first, I didn't think that there would be enough material to do a sermon on imminence, but it turns out that there really is quite a bit more when you dig into it. So this will not just be a sermon today, but it'll also be next week too, because there's that much information on it. And so I've also subtitled this, which I don't usually do, but it's important here because we're not going to be just looking at the doctrine of imminence, which we're going to be seeing. It's also about that we should be like people waiting for their Lord. And it's an attitudinal thing for us. It's how we should be looking at the world and looking at ourselves and our commitment to God as well. And so these two things might not seem connected at first, but they really are connected. The idea, you'll see how it comes together in just a little bit here. And I'll also explain what imminence is too, if you didn't read that article earlier. So these two ideas, the more spiritual side of being like people waiting for the Lord and the more technical side of the doctrine of imminence, are going to come together and make some sense as we go into this. So that's what we're doing today. Assuming I can change screens again, great. Okay, so we'll start with the doctrine of imminence. And this is an idea that people came up with from reading the Bible, that Jesus could return at any time. And you've probably heard that expressed. And it isn't just a general kind of at any time. It really means that Jesus could just as likely, or he's just as likely to arrive 5 minutes from now as he is 5 days from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now. And so the doctrine of imminence really is about the idea that you can't possibly have any idea when Jesus is going to come, because he could come at any time. And so it's that idea that we don't know anything about when he's going to come, and therefore we should live a particular way is what it really gets to, and we'll see that in the verses here. And so the people who support this, the proponents of this doctrine, claim that the church has always believed in imminence, but it looks like this idea of imminence really came about somewhere in the 1800s, along with another idea called the pre-tribulation rapture. And those two ideas kind of support each other, and they're linked together, and we'll see some of that, not this week, but next week. And so the pre-tribulation rapture, if you're not familiar with that, is an idea that Jesus is going to come in a rapture only, not the second coming. They separate the rapture from the second coming, and they say that Jesus is going to come before the tribulation starts. And we've talked about that tribulation period before, and then the real second coming happens after that. So that's the idea, and that idea we know for sure came around in the 1850s, and it seems like this doctrine of imminence also came around about that same time. And as I said, they're linked together, and it kind of makes sense that they would support each other. And so understanding or accepting this doctrine of imminence has other effects other than just understanding it as a doctrine. It understands our understanding of prophecy and what prophecy means and how it relates to the other events of the end time. And it also affects our beliefs about the order of end time events. And we'll see how all of these things make more sense as we get into it. And it affects the way we look at how we should live our life until Jesus returns. And it also, and because of all these things, it's important that we understand that it is a biblical idea, or if it is a biblical idea. And that's really what we're going to deal with here today, is looking at whether this is a biblical idea. It is a widely accepted idea. This is a very common thing. If you ask most people in most churches whether they believe that Jesus could come at any moment, they will say yes. But we'll be looking at that to see if that's really what the Bible says, and that is going to be important to understanding this. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that there's a bad doctrine that is widely accepted, because we've seen that before, and our church particularly understands that there are lots of doctrines out there that are just not biblical doctrines. Nonetheless, they're widely held by a lot of churches, and we'll see that here as well. So this doctrine is said to be based on Jesus' words to his disciples about things that would happen in the near future and even in the far future. And so their question to Jesus was, now he had started the conversation, and they said, okay, when will all these things happen? That comes from Mark 13:4. And Jesus' response to them And he says, of that day or hour, no man knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when that time is. And that comes from Mark 13, but many verses later. And so there's a big gap in between that question and Jesus, or this line, part of Jesus' answer. And Jesus gives a much larger answer. And we'll dig into what he says in there because it's really important to understanding this particular verse. So part of the problem with this doctrine is they tend to pick out a couple verses that support the idea, and they don't consider all of the other verses that are associated to this, even in this Mark. And we're going to look at more of those verses to see if that's really what Jesus meant to say. So going on from that, this is the verses that we saw there, and that what's called the Olivet Discourse, the Jesus' speech from the Mount of Olives is what that means. So this Olivet Discourse is Jesus addressing this topic of things that are going to happen in the future. And it's so important that it's included in 3 of the Gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke, but not in John. And there's like 40 verses there, so it's a lengthy bit of discussing things that are going to be happening. And one of those comes from Luke 12, verses 36 through 40, and he says this same idea that we saw on the previous slide. Be you also therefore ready, for in that hour when you are not expecting, the Son of Man comes. And so because of this belief that what Jesus is talking about is that you have no idea when he's coming, many people believe the command to be ready implies imminence. And you see that in that verse, it says, be ready. And so they say, well, be ready must mean that he could come at any moment. And so because that verse says that, they say, therefore, the church has always believed in imminence because that's what the Bible says. But as I said before on the other slide, there's some indications that this idea of imminence, that Jesus could come at any moment, didn't really evolve until the 1800s. And so to look into this some more, we're going to look at lots of verses here in this. And we'll be focusing on Matthew quite a bit, but remember Matthew, Mark, and Luke say very, very similar things here. And so we're going to dig into those. We're going to look at, immediately, we're going to look at both Matthew, Mark, and Luke in what they say right at the verses that follow this one. And then we're going to look at that gap that I mentioned before that comes between the disciples asking the question of what's going to happen in the future and Jesus saying these words about be ready, you don't know when I'm coming. So that's looking ahead to what we're going to do today. And so the question that we want to deal with here is that what Jesus meant? Did he mean that he was going to come at any time and you couldn't have any idea when he was going to come? And so we ask, what does it mean to be ready? He says, be ready because you don't know when I'm coming. And that question also kind of is tied into another question, which is what happens if we're not ready? And so what does it mean to be ready? Did he mean that we should be watching the sky all of the time to see him show up in the sky? Did he mean that we need to be ready to jump up and greet him when he arrives, or do we need to do something else when he arrives? So what does it mean to be ready is a big part of this question here, and part of I think the misunderstanding that people have here. And so if we don't do these things that we're supposed to do when he arrives, will we miss him? Will we not be taken up to meet him? What's going to happen if we don't do that? And so if we do that, though, that wouldn't allow any time for sleep. So it kind of doesn't make sense. You couldn't be watching all the time. You couldn't be ready all the time because there are other things we have to do. Sleep is a big part of that. So we're going to see here that Jesus is speaking of spiritual readiness, and even more so an ongoing spiritual readiness, a continuing readiness about always being ready. And so he's not so much talking about being ready at the time of that event, whenever it happens. He's talking about you should live your life in a state of spiritual readiness. And we'll see more verses that say exactly that thing. And so it's not about being ready at that moment, the moment when he arrives. It's about a life of being ready. And Jesus' concern, as we know from many other things, is always about the spiritual state of people. And we'll see verses here that will also talk about that. And so he wants people to always be in that spiritual state where they are working, doing the things he's supposed to do, building churches, starting churches, bringing people to churches, testifying to people, living a life we're supposed to live. All of those things Jesus wants us to continue on doing. And so what Jesus is really doing here is warning us not to become spiritually lazy or spiritually asleep, it's often called. And that's the thing that you can easily fall into if you aren't being ready and aren't being spiritually ready in your life. And we probably know people in our lives who've fallen away spiritually from our own experiences, and I've seen that myself. So that's what Jesus is really focused on, is the spiritual state of people, and he wants people to always be in that state of readiness for his return. And we see that in a passage here from Mark, and this continues on from the verse that I read earlier, and it says, "But of that day and of that hour no man knows, neither the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. Take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when that time is." I read that part earlier. And so it continues on. "It is like a man who traveled abroad and left his house and gave authority to his servants, and to each man his work. And he commanded the gatekeeper to be watchful. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house comes, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or in the morning." Cockcrow is when the rooster crows, which is right at sunset or sunrise. "Lest suddenly he come and find you sleeping." And there's that idea of sleeping. "But what I say to you, I say the same to all of you, be watching." So here, as I mentioned, we see that idea of sleeping, and he's talking about spiritual sleep, although he's talking about a physical example of people waiting for the master of the house to return. And he's saying that the people who are in the house, the housekeepers and the people who are taking care of the house while the master is away, should always be in a state where they are ready to receive him. And we're talking about a spiritual state. We're not talking about a physical state of cleaning your house. And so we also see the warning to be watchful. And this watchful is not watching the sky watchful. It's watching yourself, watching the effects the world is having on you, keeping out the false teachings that the world is trying to get into you. All of those kinds of things are the watchfulness that we need to have. And that watchfulness keeps us from falling asleep spiritually. And that's what, again, Jesus doesn't want us to be doing. He doesn't want us to be getting lazy about our lives or falling asleep and becoming useless. And so we're going to see verses that talk about this. In Matthew, we're going to look at here, Jesus gives more examples of what it means to be ready. And we're going to dig into this in a bigger way a little bit later on. But he starts here by saying, "But just as the days of Noah, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For just as they were eating and drinking before the flood, and they were taking wives and they were taking husbands, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not perceive until the flood came and took them all away. Thus will be the coming of the Son of Man." So he's talking about Noah as being an example of that, and the people of that time being an example of that. And notice what he says here. He says they were eating and drinking. Now, there's nothing wrong with eating and drinking. We have to do that. And they were taking wives and they were taking husbands, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. Until the day that Noah entered their ark. So what is the point that he's making there? He's saying that people were just doing the things of life. They were going on and doing all the ordinary things, and because they were just stuck in the world, living the worldly lives that they lived, they were spiritually asleep, and they did not perceive until the flood came and took them all away. So it gives us an idea of what he means by readiness. He means that idea of living our lives always as though he could come at any time. But that doesn't mean that he's going to come at any time. And we'll back that up some more as we go along here. So the people before the flood were stuck on their lives that they were living. They weren't acceptable lives. That's why God had sent this flood. And they were not ready for that. They were not spiritually ready at all. So here's another one that continues on from the Matthew passage. And it says, "Wake up, therefore, for you do not know in what hour your Lord will come. But know this, if the house owner had known in which watch the robber would come, he would have been awake and would not have allowed his house to be broken into." And so we're seeing here again this idea of being spiritually awake represented in a physical scenario. So what he's saying is, wake up, therefore, for you do not know in what hour your Lord will come. And we don't know exactly the moment he's going to come, the day or even the year that he's going to come. None of that is clear to us. But he says, know this, that the house owner, and he's talking about you, you wouldn't have been surprised by his coming and found yourself unprepared for his coming if you had been awake. And so that wakefulness is what he wants. He wants everyone to be spiritually awake and maintain that spiritual wakefulness always. And as I said before, that's living the Christian life that we should be living and doing the things that we should be doing, growing in the Spirit, all of those sorts of things. Many different things make up that life. And so that's Jesus' real message here is don't fall asleep. Be watchful that you don't fall asleep. And so we see also in Matthew, it says, who is the servant who is faithful and wise, whom his Lord has appointed over the children of his household, to give them food in his time? Blessed is that servant whom, when his master will come, will find doing this. Amen, I say to you, he will set him over everything that he has. And so this particular part of the parable here is directed at ministers. Those are the people whom God has appointed over the children, is what he says. And so the ministers also this is addressed to, and that they shouldn't become spiritually asleep. And so when Jesus returns, he wants those ministers who are still serving to be found giving the children their food, he says. And of course, he means spiritual food by that. And so again, we see that idea that not just the ordinary people of the church, but the ministers of the church, the people who have other functions like that, who are appointed to be over the children, they have that same need to be always spiritually awake and not to fall asleep and not to drift away from God. Is what happens when you fall asleep. You drift away and you lose contact and you become lost completely. And so that's Jesus' concern in all of these things and with all of these examples. And this one, as I said, is directed towards the ministers, that they not fall away because they've fallen asleep. And he says also here, these are a bunch of parables that all come after the Matthew part. So, but if an evil servant will say in his heart, my Lord delays to come, and will start to beat his associates and eat and drink with drunkards, the Lord of that servant will come on the day that he has not expected, and in the hour in which he is not aware, and he will cut him off, and he will set his portion with the phonies. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So again, here we're speaking of the ministers in this way, and he says, if an evil servant will say in his heart, my Lord delays to come, and that's really the focus of what he's saying here, is if you start to think that there is some time before Jesus is going to arrive, then you can become distracted and spiritually confused and fall away. And this is described as spiritual drunkenness here. And so the spiritual confusion is related to drunkenness here. And so he's saying, if you think that you shouldn't live your life as though Jesus could arrive at any time, then you will start to think of other things. And as I said before, this is directed at ministers who don't love the truth of God. And instead, they tell themselves that there is time before Jesus is going to come. And so they can explore new understandings. And we're seeing a lot of that right now, new understandings of the Bible and God's word, and teach that nonsense. And when he says in this parable, beat his associates, that's what he's talking about. He is equating teaching false things to the people as beating the people of the church. And he said, talks about and hanging around with other people who are also spiritually confused and eating what they are making. And that's the eat and drink with drunkards that he's talking about here. So their destiny in the end, he says, eternal torment is what that is. And so he's talking here about those ministers who have decided to explore different understandings of the Bible and teach those things to the people of the church. And he says that's an evil thing to do. And in fact, even more evil than that is simply the idea of saying, my Lord delays to come, and saying, I can take advantage of this situation. I can do some things here that I wouldn't normally do because I know that Jesus isn't going to come. And then later on, when I'm sure that he is going to come, then I can get right with him, and then everything will be fine. But that's not the attitude we should ever have in our lives. That evil attitude is going to be talked about later on here too. That's the wrong heart. God doesn't want a heart that is saying those kind of things, making that kind of calculation about how he should live his life and not living 100% for God. We should always be living a life that is the same, constant, always doing the same thing. There shouldn't be a day of the week like a Sunday or a Sabbath when we're different from any other day of the week. We shouldn't be a different person in church than we are all the rest of our lives. We should always be the same person and always be that godly person, no matter what. And so just the idea of saying that I see that there's an opportunity here to do something different, to step out of my normal role and do that, that's an evil thought. And this brings to mind an example that I heard from the pastor of the church that I was at before I went to NHU. He was an excellent speaker, and he went to a speakers convention. Most of the people there were ministers, but some of them were just professional speakers, motivational speakers, things like that. And so he was hobnobbing with a lot of these people, most of whom were ministers, and getting to know them. And he noticed that there were quite a few ministers there who had let their hair down, is the expression we used. They were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. They were getting drunk. And some of them were hanging around with women that certainly couldn't have been their wives. It could not have been their wives, because none of the wives were invited to this. It was just for the speakers. And so he saw in that, and he was telling me about that when he got back. He was really shocked at that. The idea that people would be something different when they think that they aren't being watched by their congregation, that they are in a different place, and that now it makes it okay for them to live a different life, to be a different person than they really are. And that's exactly the evil that God doesn't want us to have in our hearts. That idea that we can take an opportunity to live in a way that we really want to. And that's kind of what guides you to do that, is you adore that lifestyle of sin, and you want to get back to that whenever there's a little chance that you can do that, and you think you can get away with it. And so that's what Jesus is really focused on, is 24/7 living that life, being that person that God wants you to be all that time. And so that's really what all of these messages are out, all these parables that Jesus is giving us, all of these verses that we're looking at, is that Jesus wants you to be a full-time, all the time Christian, living that life at all the time, as though he could come at any time. And so I think I've talked through a lot of these points here. So Jesus is talking about these false ministers, and the false minister that sees that there is some time, and he falls asleep spiritually. And in this confused state, he does not see that the time is near. And so the things at that time come up on him when he isn't aware of them, isn't expecting those things to come. So Jesus, in fact, is warning them and us also that he's going to be gone for a while. And he knows that when he's gone, there's going to be this temptation that people are going to think, well, he's going to be gone for a while, so I can get away with some things, doing some things, and not being ready. And that's, of course, the evil idea that God doesn't want us to have. And we'll see this again some more in other verses. So these verses have been coming from Matthew 24. And Matthew 25 begins with the parable of the virgins. And I'm sure you've heard about that many times, read it yourself. And in that parable, we see the same idea. These virgins knew that there was still some time, and they took a nap, and they because of that, they weren't ready. They had found that their lamps had run out of oil because it had been so long. And so in doing so, they weren't really ready when he came, and they found themselves without what they needed to have, and they weren't spiritually ready. And so not just Matthew 24, but Matthew 25 continues on with that same idea of always being spiritually ready, as though he could come at any time. And there's another verse here from Luke that I want to go through. And I think that Luke actually says it best. And this is where the subtitle for this message came from. He says, be like people waiting for their Lord. And so he's saying, that's how you should live your life all the time. Be like people who are waiting for their Lord. And he says, when he will return from the wedding chamber, so that whenever he comes and knocks, they open to him at once. Blessings to those servants who, when their Lord will come, he shall find while they are watching. Amen, I say to you, that he shall gird his waist, and he shall make them recline, and he shall go through and shall wait on them, and he will come in, and if he will come in the second or third watch, and he will find them thus, blessings to those servants. So the same idea is expressed here. But it's said better, I think, by saying that be like people, be meaning continue to be, always being in that state of being ready, being people who are waiting for their Lord and ready for him to arrive. And so, kind of summarizing all of these verses here, we see that Jesus' message is about maintaining that spiritual state all the time in our lives, never deviating from it, never trying to take a time out and do something else, never finding opportunities to get away with things. That shouldn't be part of our nature. And so we should live our lives as though he could return at any time. We should be watchful also that we don't become confused by what the world teaches, deceived by our desires for things, and we don't become tired or lazy and falling asleep spiritually. And that will be the temptation when he's gone for so long. Here we are, it's the year 2021, so it's been almost 2,000 years now that he's been gone. So and he knew that that would be the case when he gave this message. And he was knowing that people are going to have this temptation to do things that they shouldn't be doing. And he says, I want you to always be ready, as though I could come at any time. And so that brings up the question, was he really saying that he was going to come at any time? And we've seen in these verses that he was really more interested in his followers not wandering away from the faith, or not being dragged away from the faith by the things of the world. And so while he was gone, he wanted them to keep this attitude always of living always the way they should live, as though we could return at any time. And he wants that to be the Christian walk. But the question comes, does he mean that he could return at any time? Does he mean that that's in 5 minutes he could be here, or in 10 minutes? Is it that soon, or is it just as likely that he might be 50 years from now? And so when we look at other verses in the Bible, and we're going to do that, it isn't possible to accept the idea that he could return at any time. And the reason is that he himself, Jesus, says that there are many things that must happen before he would return. And remember how we defined imminence at the start. Imminence means it could happen just as likely in 5 minutes as 50 years. And there's nothing in there that is more likely. There's no time that's more likely than any other time. And so as soon as Jesus says there are things that must happen first, we know that it can't be imminent, because those things haven't happened. And we also know from all over the Bible, there are prophecies, Old Testament, lots of prophecies there, New Testament prophecies as well, Revelation especially. And these describe events that are plainly events that must happen before he returns. And we're going to go through some of these. And so these prophecies must come true, or else God is a liar. And God says, I'm not a liar. Therefore, the prophecies must be fulfilled, at least the ones that are going to be fulfilled before he arrives. And as I said, some of those are very plain of things that are going to happen before he arrives. And so those things must happen first. And because of that, it can't be imminent. And so what we're going to look at next is the Mount of Olives speech, which I talked about before, Olivet Discourse it's called. So we're going to look through this in detail and look at all of the things that Jesus says are going to happen before he comes, and get a good understanding of what is meant by that. So I'm going to work through these bit by bit. I've taken those verses and I've broken them into bullet points for each specific thing that he says must happen before he comes. So, and when Yeshua sat on towards Zatha, which means the Mount of Olives, his disciples came, and they were saying among themselves and to him, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your advent and of the end of the world. Yeshua answered and said to them, beware that no man will deceive you, for many will come in my name, and they will say, I am the living God, the Messiah, and they will deceive many. So that's his first warning. The very first thing he says is watch out for deceivers. And notice what's happened. They've asked him when these things are going to happen. Tell us about when, and what signs we should look for to see that you're coming. And his answer isn't an answer to the when question. It's a look out. There are people coming who are going to deceive you. And he says these people are going to deceive many people. And lots of other prophecies back this up as well. And so his first warning is watch out. There are people who are going to deceive many people. The next bullet point is verse 6. Take heed that you will not be troubled, for it is necessary that all these things should happen, but it will not yet be the end. So that isn't so much a description of something that will happen, but it's a warning to us. Take heed. These things are going to happen. Be expecting them. He'll later on say, I've warned you about these things. Be watching for them. And verse 7 says, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, in our time, that's not really a new thing. But there's been lots of that since. We've had lots of great wars, and Revelation talks about many great wars yet to come, and horrible wars. And that verse continues on and says, and there will be famines and plagues and earthquakes in various places, but all these things are the beginning of sorrows. So we know that there have been famines and plagues and earthquakes, and the value in this, and we might think that what's the point of telling us that there's going to be earthquakes when there are earthquakes almost every year. In California, there's many every year, because he's talking not just about ordinary earthquakes and not just ordinary famines and ordinary plagues. He's talking about things that are exceptional beyond what would normally happen. And other prophecies talk about this. One of them talks about an earthquake so large that the earth actually wobbles in space because of that earthquake. So we're talking about not just ordinary things. These are things that you can say at the time that you see them. Boy, that's not the ordinary earthquake. That's not your ordinary plague or famine. And so these are exceptional instances of these things. And he says, these are going to come, expect them, they're going to happen. But all these things are the beginning of sorrows. They're not even the end. These are things that are going to happen first. And then he says, and then they will deliver you to suffering, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all the nations because of my name. And we know that that's been true throughout history as well. The apostles, most of them except for John, died bad deaths, executions of some sort or another. And that has happened throughout all of Christianity. Christians have been tortured for being Christians and mistreated, sometimes even by other Christians. And that's just been part of the existence that we live as Christians. We were talking earlier about expecting that the Christian life, the Christian walk would be an easy walk. It hasn't been in history. It's been a difficult walk. Many times the expectation has been that you could be killed for the faith that you hold. And so he says these things are going to happen as well. And so what he's putting together is a list of things, great things to look for. And when you see all of these things together, then you will know we're really close. And we'll get to the verses that say that. So verse 10 says, and then many will be subverted because of that, because people are being executed and mistreated and persecuted for being Christians. Many will be subverted, and they will hate one another and will betray one another. So people, even inside of the faith he's talking about, will start to turn against the faith and begin to betray the other people in the faith. Verse 11 says, and many false prophets will arise and will deceive many. So again, he's come back to this idea of watch out for deceivers, because these are one of the great dangers. Revelation talks about that too. The false prophets who seem to be prophets, but they aren't. They're teaching a bad story along with that. Verse 12 talks about, and because of the abundance of evil, the amount of evil that's going on at that time, the love of many will grow cold, but whoever will persevere until the end will have life. And that's a good thing to just stop and pause on. He's saying things are going to be really bad. And in this time, worse than you've ever seen before. If you're in that time, hold on, persevere until the end. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be there at the end when Jesus comes. You may have been executed before that time, but that will have been your end and not the end when Jesus comes. But in either case, persevere until the end of your life, whichever way it happens. And he says that's going to be the only way to get through it, is to have this attitude that it's going to be bad and be ready for that and to persevere through it. So verse 14 says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world for the testimony of all the nations, and then the end will come. So this is one of the very last things that happen. And many people have been watching this. It says that the gospel message is going to be preached to the whole world. And we are so close to that now, you wouldn't believe it. The Bible is available in almost every known language now. And there are people who are taking those translations out to all of those people. It's almost impossible to imagine that right now there is some language or some people group with a language that they don't have a Bible, or they haven't heard the message of the Bible and haven't had a chance to understand it and accept it. And so that's one of the signs that I keep an eye on, is this is really close to being fulfilled, if it hasn't been fulfilled already. The whole world, if they haven't heard about Jesus now, it won't be long until they've all heard about Jesus. And this verse ends with, and then the end will come. So that's one of the very last things that will be happening before Jesus comes. So again, that's an important sign for our time. Continuing with verse 15. But whenever you will see the desecrated sign of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, he who reads should consider. Okay, this is talking about a prophecy that is referred to by both Daniel and in Revelation. And it's talking about something that's going to happen. I've talked about it before. This is the temple is going to be rebuilt, and right near the end, the man of evil, the man of sin he's called, is going to break into that and bring in some desecration that will cause the temple to be desecrated. We don't know exactly what that is. We know that he's in the pattern of Epiphanes, who was a guy who brought a pig into the temple back before Jesus' time. And so he's going to do something in the temple which will be rebuilt. So in fact, what we know from this is that there are a couple things that have to happen. First of all, we know that the temple has to exist for this to happen. Therefore, the temple has to have been built on the Mount of Olives, or not on the Mount of Olives, sorry, on the Temple Mount. And for that to happen, it isn't happening right now because there are people who are preventing it from happening. So there's a few things that have to happen before this could even come true. And so we know that something has to change to make it possible to rebuild the temple, and then this person is going to break in and desecrate it. So that's one of the signs that we can say, boy, that definitely hasn't happened yet. There isn't even a temple up there right now. So that's something for us to watch for. And so he says that Daniel said this, and think about this. He says, watch for this sign. Verse 16, then when this happens, this desecration of the temple happens, and I think it's Luke that talks about a little bit more about what happens at that time. He says there's a whole army that surrounds Jerusalem, and this commander of this army is the person who comes in and does the desecration. And he says, so when that happens, then those who are in Judea should flee to the mountains. And the one who is on the roof should not come down and take what is in his house, and he who is in the field should not return to take his clothes. But woe to pregnant women and to those who are nursing in those days. But pray that your escape will not be in winter, neither on the Sabbath. For then there will be great suffering, which has not been from the beginning of the world, even until now. Neither will be. If those days are not cut short, no one would live. But because of the chosen ones, those days will be cut short. So there's quite a few things in there. I didn't break it all down into pieces. But he's saying, when you see this sign, if you're in Israel, flee for the mountains, run, get on your horse and ride. It's time to go. And don't go back to the house, don't stall, don't pause, get out of town, because it's going to happen. And he says it's going to be, starting then until the end, it will never have been a worse time in all of mankind's history. And so he says there will be great suffering, which has not been from the beginning of the world, even until now. So things are going to become really, really bad at that point. And this is commonly called the last half of the tribulation, which is called the Great Tribulation, when things get really, really bad at the end. So Jesus is warning us about all of these things to watch for and the consequences of them so that we can be prepared for them if we're living at that time. Continuing in verse 23. Then if someone will say to you, behold, the Messiah is here or there, you should not believe. And so this is going back to that same idea of false prophets and false messiahs. And he says, if these things are going to happen, these people are going to show up, they're going to claim to be me, or they're going to be claim to be some prophet of me. They aren't. Don't believe these people. I've told you how things are going to happen. I've told you the signs to watch for. Don't be fooled by these people. And that's, we know Jesus' heart is for us, and he wants us to do well and not fall away spiritually. And so he's warned us here about this thing repeatedly. He's talked about these false prophets and false messiahs, and he will again in the next verse. And so this is important to him, that we understand that there are going to be deceivers out there who are going to be really impressed to us. And Revelation actually puts hard numbers on it. It says that all of the people who are weak in faith will fall away from the faith. And he says that even 1/3 of the people of the elect, which is what the next verse refers to them as, 1/3 of them will lose some level of faith. Not necessarily all of it, but will lose some of their faith. And so let's just go to verse 24 right away. He says, for false messiahs will arise, and prophets of lies, and they will give great signs so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So that's what I was saying before. That even some of the people who are strong in the faith right now will be weakened by what they see and the deception that's going on. And he says, and here's the warning. He says, behold, I have told you beforehand to watch for these things. They're going to happen. If you're alive at that time, don't be deceived by this, but it's going to be a strong deceit. You need to be watching out for it. Verse 26 says, if therefore they will say to you, behold, he is in the desert, you should not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room. Do not believe that. So he's saying that these deceivers are going to tell you the Messiah is here. He's over here. You can go and see him, or the Messiah is over here. You can go and see him here. Don't believe any of that stuff. He says, in kind of in a summary way, he's saying, "I've told you what to look for. Don't be fooled by these people." Verse 27. Just as lightning goes out from the east and appears unto the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the body will be, there will the eagles be gathered. That one's a little bit cryptic, but he says when it happens, when I arrive, it's not going to be people going to say he's over in this room here, or he's over in this house, or he's out in the desert here. It's not going to be like that. He says when I arrive, it's going to be just like lightning across the sky. He says, just as a lightning strike crosses through the sky, my arrival is going to be like that. And so that's an important thing for us to understand as well. Now, this phrase, wherever the body will be, there will the eagles be gathered, is an idiom from that time. We talked about idioms many times. What it means is these things are the natural consequence of what's going to happen. They're just to be expected. People are going to do these things, and that's just the way it's going to be, if you can kind of understand that. But immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will darken and the moon will not show its light, and the stars will fall from the heavens, and the power of the heavens will be disturbed. So he says at the very, very end of it, there will be changes even in the sun and the moon, and the amount of light that falls on earth, and the stars from the heavens will fall and change, and things are going to be very different. Isaiah and others talk about that as the heavens being rolled up like a scroll. So if you're kind of looking up in the sky, somehow it would be like all of the stars and everything just disappearing like a scroll was rolling up. That's a hard thing for us to relate to or even imagine. Nonetheless, he says that'll be the last sign. When you see that, I'm at the door, I'm ready. So verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear, and then all the families of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man who comes in on the clouds of heaven with miracles and many praises. And he will send his angels with great trumpets, and they will gather his own elect from the four winds, from all the ends of the heavens. So having said all of these things that are going to happen first, he says, and then the sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. And so that's when all of these things have come together and happened. He says, that's when I'll be showing up. Don't listen to the false prophets and false messiahs, all of those people who are trying to deceive you. It won't be like that. Don't fall for that. This is what it will be like, and that's what you will see. So he's really gone into 3 slides here of details about things to look for. And so we can say for sure that with all of these things that must happen first, and especially the one with Daniel, that's one that I kind of like. There isn't even a temple on the Temple Mount, so you couldn't possibly have that desecration happen. Therefore, there's still time. We know there's time. And that takes us back to one of our premises here is even though we know that there is time still, that doesn't mean we should be fooling around and doing things we shouldn't do. We should be the constant person that we should always be in him. So some of these signs don't seem that conclusive. The earthquakes, for example, I talked about that one. There have been earthquakes before Jesus' time, during his time, and ever since his time, and sometimes some pretty big ones. Not long ago, we had that big Japanese earthquake. And so other prophecies talk about these things, but it talks about, as I said, that one really big earthquake that is going to come, and it's going to be something that we're really going to recognize when it happens. And so this verse that I'm going to read next comes from Matthew, but it's very similar in Mark and Luke, Mark 13 and Luke 21, which are the other ones that where Jesus is, the other accounts of this message that Jesus is giving on the Mount of Olives. So verse 32 from Matthew 24 says, but learn a parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branches bow low and its leaves bud forth, you know that summer has arrived. So also, whenever you see all these things, know that he has approached the door. Amen. I say to you that this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. A lot of people don't understand that correctly. He's saying, in the same way that you can see that things happen on this earth, and you know that other things are about to happen because of that. He says, because when you're looking at a fig tree and you see its branches start to bow down, low down, and its leaves start to bud forth, you know that summer has arrived. And he says, you can see from those signs of the physical world, and you know how to make decisions about what's coming based on those things. And he's saying, in the same way, you will be able to look for these signs. You'll be able to see all these signs. And when there's a group of people who sees all of these signs all together, know that the time is really close. He's at the door. It's about to happen. And so he says, amen, I say to you that the generation, that this generation that sees all of these things together happening will not pass away until these things do happen. So he says those people who have been watching for this and have been watching these signs and seeing them, when they've seen all of these signs, they will know that it's really close, really going to happen soon. And whether that's us, whether we live to that time to see those things, I don't know. Nonetheless, we should still be living our lives as we should always live. And so one thing that came up here was these false messiahs and false prophets, people who claim to be God or claim to be Jesus. And it's interesting that Wikipedia has a page that lists all of the people who have claimed to be Jesus or others have claimed that they were Jesus. And there's a list of like 30 people, and I think about 8 of them, if I remember correctly, are still living. Most of them are dead, obviously. Some of those go back a very long time. And they were people who claimed to be Jesus. And of the people who are still living, obviously they can't all be correct. They can't all be Jesus. There can only be one Jesus. So at the very best, only one of those people could be Jesus. And we know it's not him because he said in these verses that we just read, this is what my coming is going to be like. It's not going to be me showing up in a house claiming to be Jesus. It's going to be like a streak of lightning across the face of the sky. It's not going to be like these people are claiming to be Jesus, have lived and are living. So these signs are important for us to understand. But in the context of this message, there are things that must happen before Jesus is going to come. So his at this moment right now, his arrival is not imminent. When all of these things have come, then his arrival is imminent. And so that's what he's saying. When you see these things all together, you will know that his arrival is imminent at that time. And so that's the big message to take away here. So we're going to do some more of this next week, but I'll just summarize what we've covered so far. There are many people who want to believe that be ready infers that Jesus could come at any moment. He could come in 5 minutes or 50 years. It's not that. That's not what it was ever meant to be. It's a warning that Jesus is going to be gone for what seems like a long time to us, 2,000 years and counting. It's a message about the kind of people that we are to be. That's really what this is about, is we need to be those consistent, steady, true, faithful, authentic people, the people who don't try to find an opportunity to go out and sin and do something wrong. That should never be our attitude. We should always be the people who are living that life 24/7. And so what Jesus doesn't mean is that it doesn't mean that he could actually come in 5 minutes. It means that I want you to live that life all of the time. Be consistent in the way you live in everything, and do that as though I could arrive at any time. And so we also saw the idea that while he is gone, we should be doing the things he wants us to do. And that includes living the Christian life, walking the walk of faith, giving to others, supporting others, helping others, all of those sorts of things that make up Christianity. We should be doing that every day, 24/7, and it should just be our natural life to do that. We shouldn't have in us a desire to do anything but that. And we should never see his absence as a chance to go out and do things that would displease him. We know that he sees what we do, and it should never be that kind of a thing. Nonetheless, we know that there are people who do those kind of things, and they aren't 24/7 Christians. And so we should be doing what's right because we love him, not because we're afraid of getting caught doing wrong. And that's the attitude, again, that we should have always. We should be doing those things not because Jesus so much said that we should be doing them, but we should be doing them because we love him. That should be our foundation for everything, is we live the life that we live always because we love him and we want to please him, and we would never want to displease him. And so our lives should consist of this constant readiness of living the way we should always be living, as though he could come at any time. That's the kind of people we should be always. And one last slide. So Jesus gave us this long list of things to come. We went through that in great detail. And so the generation that sees all of these occurring will not die out. It'll happen. Once you've seen all of those things happen, it's really close. And so that generation won't even die out. They will live to see the very happening of the second coming. So next week, we're going to go into some more things that have to happen first. Look at what different passages say about that. And we're going to look at imminency again and why people believe in imminency and why they want to believe in imminency, that idea that Jesus could come at any moment. And we also look at mistakes that people have made because they believe Jesus could come at any time. And I think you'll find some of those quite interesting because Church of God Seventh Day has had some problems in the past about that. So those are the things that we'll look at next week.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, I was just about prophecies and stuff like that. I mean, I think because Jesus purposely did not give a specific date or a number of years when this stuff would happen, obviously that's why he wants us to always be spiritually aware. And I mean, I can see how people get confused and how hard it is to truly interpret the passages in the Bible, because there's so many of them. And one of them starts out when Jesus says, "This generation will not pass before." And what does that mean? I mean, there are many interpretations of that. I think that it would seem that some false prophets are super easy to recognize. The ones that want to hold you as a slave and they say you must give me all your money now, and the ones especially that say that somehow they need to have sex with all the young women that they can, and they're ones like that. That's kind of easy. The messiahs that say, okay, it's going to be on January 18th, 1985. That's, those people that dressed up in those black Nikes and laid in the bed in San Diego and, stuff, because they thought those are the easy ones. But there have been people that I think had good intentions that ever since, Jesus left, that has said, okay, I think we're now in the end times. And that's been a lot of people that have done that. And it could be misinterpretation of the Bible. I think there have been a lot of people that didn't have any nefarious purposes. They just misinterpreted passages of the Bible because this stuff is hard to understand.
Yes, parts of it certainly are. You made a lot of good points there. There are a lot of these, or have been a lot of these false prophets and false messiahs already. Nonetheless, they have deceived a surprising number of people. You would say, how could you miss this person and see that they're a fraud? Nonetheless, people have fallen for it. It's quite amazing. Hundreds of people. The Jim Jones thing, the Waco thing, is a smaller version of that. So nonetheless, we are wise enough to understand that some of these false prophets and false messiahs really are false and obviously false. And so Jesus is warning us that there will be some who are going to come, who are going to give signs and do things that are going to amaze us in ways that we are just not prepared for. And we need to be ready for those. So we're not talking about your ordinary, everyday Jim Jones kind of person. We're talking about something really special, something exemplary.
You mentioned something about Daniel also in the sermon.
Yeah.
He was told a lot of things that were going to happen, but he never saw any of that.
Nope.
And that doesn't make it not true. It's kind of like God operates on a completely different time level, from us. Kind of like Abraham. God told him and Sarah, or that they would be the father and mother of many nations, but they never got to see that, And so that's the tricky thing about those things, is that God promises things, and we just assume, oh, okay, well that's I'm ready, and that must be tomorrow. But it's a completely different time thing, for us. But he says, I'm not a man that I can give my word and take it back. So he's already said it. He puts himself on record. And I think that's really what he was doing. He was putting himself on record. Not that we should interpret that to mean, well, it's imminent, it's coming any minute or whatever. But I agree in the sense that we need to live our lives as if he's coming tomorrow, not because he is coming tomorrow, but because maybe we're going to go meet him tomorrow. Who knows? We might die. You know, I know plenty of people that didn't wake up this morning, or not this morning, but they didn't wake up the next morning, that they had just assumed that they will be back. But you just never really know. But anyway, that's what I appreciate about the Lord, is that he puts himself on the line. He puts himself on the record. But we're unfortunately human, and we just give into interpretation that it means any moment now, and that's not true, really.
And Chance, you made a point about prophecies being hard to understand, and that's certainly true. But some of them are really clear, and that's why the one from Daniel that Jesus mentioned there, I think, is so good, because Daniel is talking about a very specific physical event there, and that one you can kind of take to the bank and say this one is one you can look for to happen, and yes, it's certainly true that lots of the others are hard to make out, and people have struggled with them. But some of the reason that people have struggled with them is that they don't want to see them for what they are. And that's part of what we'll get into next week is people who want it to be an event they're going to set a date on. And they're going to say, on this date, Jesus is going to come. And so I've interpreted this piece of prophecy in a way that makes it kind of vanish. And I can say, yes, that one has been fulfilled now, so it's okay for Jesus to come. And so that'll be part of what we cover next week. We'll get into that.
Can I add something there, Stan?
Yes.
Going back to the false prophets, I mean, look at what we're dealing with in the pulpits, right, nowadays. There is this website, it's thestateoftheology.com, that, I was looking through, and they put out different surveys throughout, the years. And so they did that for 2020 as well. And so first they go out there and they interview just normal everyday adults, right? Respondents, Christians, right? And they asked specific questions. It's a long list, but one of the questions was, Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God. True or false? Do you agree or disagree? And, really, let's look at this. Let's look what they said. 52% agree. 52% of adult respondents in 2020 agreed, right? But look at this. This is even more scary. They asked the same question to U.S. evangelical respondents, right? So pastors, priests. Jesus was a great teacher, but he was not God, all right? So they're looking at this, and this is their finding. So finding was 30% agreed. 30%.
Of evangelicals, even. That's crazy.
Yeah, 30%. Like, where, who, why, what are you talking about? What are you teaching your church? That's crazy. Talk about false prophets.
Yeah, exactly. And that is amazing to us, too. How could people possibly believe that?
Heavenly Father, thank you for this time you've given us to be together as your people. Forgive us for our shortcomings and weaknesses. But I thank you for the messages we received this morning, because they were definitely inspiring and illuminating. And even though we know some of these subjects already, but we never tire of talking about them, because it's wonderful to hear different opinions and different point of views of the same subject that we're already familiar with. And it gives us greater hope and faith when we are able to share our faith and realize that we have a commonality in the way that we believe, and that we are also experiencing very similar things that has given us a greater sense of hope. And for that, we are so grateful, Lord. And be with us for the rest of our week, Lord, and abide with us and in us, Lord, and help us to reach out to more in the future. And perhaps more people are waiting to be able to get a building, and I pray that you will provide that in the right time, in the right place. But I want to ask a special blessing for all of those that were able to be with us today, and even those that could not. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.